And I sort of miss everybody since it's gone to once a month, but it really has been helpful for us in many ways. We're, as you know, winding our way closer and closer to the reopening, the grand reopening of our facility, which will look brand new by next fall. So everything's on track, and we're all hard at work trying to pull together the reinstallation of the permanent collection. So everything is very exciting right now. It's also very anxiety-producing, but that's okay. This is going to be a great escapist fare, at least for me, I know. You all know Ken very well. He's come to lecture for us many, many times. And as always, he's a delightful speaker. He's long been at the J. Paul Getty Museum at the Villa. He's a specialist of Greek and Roman. He went to Berkeley and Oxford. He's curated the most extraordinary exhibitions, including the Power and Pathos show that was so memorable a few years ago. And he has an exhibition on view right now that closes in another month on the Villa dei Papiri, about which he spoke to us last year. This time, though, he's going to talk to us about some new material that he's been digging around. And I think it's going to be very, very fascinating. Often smaller objects like these are overlooked, and he seems to have constructed yet another mesmerizing narrative around this material. So without further ado, this is Ken. Have fun with your little tiny gem.
Thank you so much. Can you all hear me on this mic or my voice? Yeah, good. Well, thank you all for coming out. I understand there are some competing events in town, so I'm really grateful to you all for showing up. I'm grateful to Ike for the invitation. I'm grateful to Jill, who first brought me here so many years ago. And today I want to talk to you, as Ike said, about smaller things, which I haven't dug up in the archaeological sense. But I want to talk to you about these exquisite small-scale works of art. When we think about Greek and Roman art and we look at our textbooks, we're very familiar with great monuments of architecture, sculpture, and painting, whether it's sculpture in marble and bronze, painting on vases or on walls. This is what our general view of Greek and Roman art has been. And this triad of architecture, sculpture, and painting was enshrined in the Renaissance by Giorgio Vasari and others. And if you go around the country, you'll see monuments to the arts with personifications of these three arts. But this is not an ancient category. The ancients valued all kinds of materials and techniques and objects. And in fact, one of our most important written sources for the history of ancient art isn't even an art history book. It's Pliny the Elder's Natural History, 37 books about all kinds of things. And in his chapters on bronze, he talks about bronze sculpture. In chapters on marble, he talks about marble. He talks about painting when talking about pigments. But the culmination of his entire magnum opus, the Natural History, book 37, is on gems and precious stones. That's at the end. He was saving the best for last. And this is the first sentence of that last chapter, book 37. For a great many people, a single gemstone alone is enough to provide the highest and most perfect aesthetic experience of the wonders of nature. I've been working on gems on and off for about the past decade. I did a small show appropriately at the Getty Villa about 10 years ago. But in May, the Getty was able to acquire at auction 17 gems of the most extraordinary quality from one of the last great collections in private hands, the Giorgio Sangiorgi collection, which was based in Monaco. And these are just, 6 of those gems. And the largest of them, this one, is that big. But they're all, most of them are about an inch or less. Most of them are intaglios, made initially as seal stones, and I'll talk more about the technique shortly. One on the left was a cameo in relief of the Egyptian goddess Isis, a later technique, and we bought a gold ring as well. And I'm not really going to talk about gold at all, very little about cameos, but just to talk a little bit about technique. when work is done in gold, it can be chased or engraved. And the essential difference is that when you engrave something, you actually cut it and you lose the metal. And if it's gold, you collect the scraps because they're valuable. Chasing is when you push the metal and you reform it, but you don't change the weight. Because these materials, whether they're gold, whether they're amethyst, carnelian, rock crystal, chalcedony, jaspers, they're intrinsically valuable. All of the gems, none of them are chased because you can't move stone the way you move soft metal. All the gems are engraved. And on this stunning, one of our new gems, showing the great Trojan hero who becomes the founder of Rome, Aeneas fleeing the walls of Troy, carrying on his back his father Anchises, the past, bringing his son Ascanius out from the gates of Troy. You see in the detail, these are all cut into the stone. They're all engraved lines. And again, this gem, it's one of the bigger ones. It's maybe 1.5 inches, and it's got a whole world, a whole story, a whole narrative with different characters. A Greek soldier up in the battlements holding a torch, a star up top telling you that it's at night. Anchises carries the sacred container with the relics of Troy, and down in the lower left here you have 3 sailors, each with Trojan caps, preparing for the departure of the ship. One blows his horn, one adjusts the sails, and another adjusts the tiller as Aeneas, who's the star of Virgil's Aeneid, climbs the stairs. Now these things, very small, and the fact that they hold their detail blown up, 50 times on the screen is evidence of their quality, but they weren't designed to be seen on the screen. They weren't designed to be seen in museum vitrines. They were designed to be worn in rings, used as seals, be parts of pendants and brooches, and to be held. They're personal objects, to be held, manipulated, and really rotated in the light and inspected. I'm very lucky I have the privilege to do that, but also we can show you photographs from different angles. And one of the remarkable things about this gem is that even inside the archway that little Ascanius comes through, the carver has carved the ashlar blocks of the cityscape. And this is going above and beyond, because when you make an impression of the gem, using it as a seal, that's not really going to show. And several times throughout this lecture, I'm going to also show you impressions. The ancients would have made them in wax or clay or plaster. Today, we make them on silicone, like your dentist does, and you can see the wonderful detail of the carvings. Now, we have gems, and we have literally thousands and thousands of them. Mostly, I'm going to be showing you the very top tier. But also, we have evidence of gems that have been lost, not just in writings like Pliny's Natural History, but in things like this. Preserved sealings in clay from archives. And they were used to sign documents, to seal text. They'd be wrapped around scrolls, and those scrolls have disintegrated. But here you see the impressions, all from Hellenistic Ptolemaic Egypt. And you can see the 2 on the left are more Greco-Roman in content and style. The 2 on the right, more Egyptian. So these were things that were really the personal insignia of people. But people could own more than one. If you had an official role, you could have your official seal and your personal seal. But we know in this period, the Hellenistic period, the wealthy and kings also began collecting, and they become the source of inspiration for poets and writers. And not just their imagery was important, but also the stones themselves often had further mystical and magical properties. For instance, the ancients thought that amethyst had to do with methi, not methi, like asymmetrical, not symmetrical. Methi was drunkenness. So it was thought an amethyst could protect you against drunkenness. Other gems were meant to make you victorious in the games. Red jasper was meant to make you successful in the courts or a good speaker. So I carry a little piece with me to help me out in these lectures. There were other beliefs that certain gems on certain days could even render you invisible. These beliefs get more and more fantastic. But the important thing is the gems and their images went together. Now, a little bit about technique. These gems, which you're not seeing, but you're seeing the reflections of that leave impressions in relief, are carved into the gem. The images are concave, and we call these intaglios, using the Italian term. Tagliare is Italian for to cut, so I'm showing you tagliatelle to remind you. So that's an intaglio. A cameo is essentially the opposite. The background is carved away, leaving the image in relief. And this is a later technique. It really develops in the Hellenistic period, and they're much more legible, the cameos, and they're often made with banded stones, and the carvers would use the different colors to separate the background. They're not so good for leaving impressions, but they're very good for brooches and medals and presentation works. This is a cameo now in Naples, an ancient cameo that was one of the many pieces collected by Lorenzo de' Medici, who had his craftsman carve his name in the bottom of a centaur. And shot obliquely, you could see this is really a 3-layer stone, but the carver has only used the top 2 layers, the white and the dark, but he's carved the dark layer differentially, so it seems to give a sense of depth. The gem on the left from about the same period shows a hermaphrodite, a combination of male and female. But again, the carver has carved over here almost all the way through the white layer to the red background to give a sense of the transparency of the drapery. Whereas this gem on the right from the Cabinet de Medailles in Paris, showing the Emperor Trajan, is a 3-banded stone where the carver has utilized all 3 layers: black for the background, white for the main figure and this ring, and then the dark above for the emperor's cloak and his wreath. So the carvers really could plan out what's going on within the stone, and this is one of my very favorites, also from Paris, that used to belong to King Charles. It's Jupiter with his eagle, but in the Middle Ages it was, I don't think mistakenly thought to be, I think it was cleverly reinterpreted as Saint John the Evangelist, because if it's a pagan king, you really wouldn't want it, but if it becomes Saint John, it continues to be valuable, and the medieval mount has verses from the Gospel of Saint John. But I love this so much because, again, it's a 3-banded cameo with a dark background, a white layer, and then a brown layer. And the carver has not only done similarly with Trajan, background, the figure and details of beard, thunderbolt, cloak, and eagle chest, but he's carved parts of the cloak through almost to the white to give a sense of highlight and transparency to the drapery. This is not so hard to do in paint, but this is being done in hard stone. Most of these gemstones are about 7 on the Mohs scale of relative hardness, 7 to 8. Marble's 4, iron is I think 6, diamond, of course, is 10. Now, if we're lucky, we're going to do something technical, and I am going to play for you a very short sort of video. Yes, I hope about how these things were actually made. So I just have to find the cursor. Tell me if you see it. If I find the cursor, I can hit the start button. There it is. Okay, so now I have to move that way and down. There we go.
The process of gem carving is the same today as it was in antiquity, although modern tools are slightly different. It begins with finding the right stone. Here, the carver chips off a piece of carnelian. He selects the color and layer of stone that suit the project. After cutting the gem further, he grinds the stone to the rough shape desired, leaving it slightly larger to allow room for carving. water flows continuously to cool the stone to prevent overheating and fracturing. The carver creates a slurry by mixing olive oil with an abrasive powder. Emery or corundum was used in antiquity, while diamond dust is used today. A metal drill is dipped in the slurry and holds the abrasive particles as they cut away tiny amounts of stone. The slurry turns brown from bits of copper ground off the tool. Using a hollow tip, a hole is drilled through the gem from both ends. The core is broken off with gentle pressure. Now the gem can be mounted in a ring or suspended on a cord as a pendant. The color of the gem can be enhanced by soaking it in a solution made of iron compounds, here from rusted nails. Heating the gem further intensifies the color. Using differently shaped tools allows the carver to cut various shapes into the stone. On the back of the gem, the artist sketches a rough form to be carved, in this case a scarab or beetle. The modern carver uses an electric drill, while ancient craftsmen used hand-powered tools. For the final stages, he uses tools made of softer materials such as wood or leather, and a slurry made of a finer abrasive. The result is a smooth, polished surface. On the other side of the stone, the carver sketches the image of a young man adjusting his sandal. The lines are bright enough for the carver to follow through the slurry, although some of the engraving is done blind. The carver relies on the vibrations of the tool to feel when it is cutting or not. The carver engraves the forms of the body with a variety of tools, which decrease in size as he carves the finer details. Lastly, the carver adds a decorative border and signs the gem. This work is a copy of an ancient Greek gem in the Getty's collection that was carved by Epimanes around 500 BC.
Okay. So now if I can return, maybe by going, yes, here. Oh, that worked. I'm so pleased. So my friend Chavdar Chushev, the gem engraver, who made that replica in our collection. But as the video noted, there are several differences. One, the use of power versus hand tools, and that's really more for convenience. Power tools, although they can achieve greater speeds, you don't really want greater speeds because that makes you lose control. It's not the tools, the metal tools, that cut the gem. It's that slurry with abrasive, and if your wheel is spinning really fast, your abrasive is going to fly off. More significantly is the fact that what Chavdar uses is essentially a Dremel, and he takes the tool to the stone. We know from ancient descriptions and some visual evidence that it was opposite. They used a lathe, or what's technically a spindle. This is a impression of a fragmentary gravestone of an 18-year-old gem engraver from Sardis, Doros, the Sardinian Adactyloglyphos, a ring carver. And at the top, it shows where it's broken here, basically the framework of a spindle and a bow wrapped around it. So by moving the bow back and forth, that would rotate the spindle, and the carver would bring the spindle, the gem to the spindle. And this is the way drills worked as well. And this is a gem in the British Museum showing a craftsman, sometimes identified as a gem engraver, but it could really just be a carpenter. You see with a point and a bow wrapped around it, drilling down into the top of a work surface. And this technique goes way back to the ancient Egyptians. As you can see, the cutting of seals and a workshop, people with bow drills doing various kinds of work. And this was done also in ancient Mesopotamia. So the techniques are quite old, and we know the names of gem engravers from the Mesopotamian period, such as Ilaknud, who made this gem. Here we have a grave stele of Lucius Utidius Hermias, a gemmarius sculptor, a gem engraver from Imperial Rome. And these techniques continued to be used in the traditional manner. Here is a early 17th century Indian gem engraver working with a similar bow drill. And even in Enlightenment France, the techniques were the same, except they had invented the foot pedal, so the gem engraver could do the same work. And here is another modern engraver using a lathe to cut a gem. And this gem's already been mounted in a ring. These gem engravers, I met them in England. There are two of them. They claim to be the largest gem engraving workshop in the UK, with two of them, father and son. Often it seems that gem engraving was passed down from father and son, while modern engravers use magnification. There's very little evidence that ancient engravers did. And as the video said, because of the slurry, because of the grains from the stone coming out, the tools getting worn down, you can't really see what you're doing anyway. You have to do it by feel. But when you come to clean and look, it helps to be nearsighted, and that's something that is passed genetically. So it's been postulated that many gem engravers had this condition. While preparing for this lecture on the internet, as one does, I found reference to this very interesting paper on the cutting of Fatimid rock crystal from the medieval Near East. And this graph shows experiments of using cutting with different kinds of tools and different abrasives and trying to match up. And this seems to me to be a very fruitful way forward, and I'm interested in pursuing this. But we know again that diamond was known to the ancients, but probably wasn't much used. What they used probably was emery or corundum, which came from the island of Naxos. That's a 9 on the Mohs scale, so it'll cut stones that are in the 7 and 8 range. Earlier in Mesopotamia and Egypt, they used softer stone, and for abrasives, they could use quartz, which is a 7, and they had plenty of that all over. So the earliest forms of engraved gems in the Bronze Age were Mesopotamian cylinder seals or Egyptian scarabs, which were copied by the Greeks and Romans. And this is one of our new scarabs set in a swivel ring, very much like the gem that Chavdar replicated, but you can see the wonderfully sculpted scarab beetle with a nice frieze on the end, and when you wore it, the device was hidden and protected in case you banged your finger around, although the stones are very hard. And then when you wanted to make an impression, you'd take it off, twist it on the swivel, and make an impression. The device of this gem is the god Apollo, the god of music, playing a lyre, wonderfully buffer than Apollo actually often is. He also has his bow because he's the archer god. And interestingly here, and this is something that really isn't well understood, often the inscriptions would be carved in reverse, so they would be left in the impression. But often they also be carved on the stone where they could be read there, and they're backwards in the impression. So while some scholars say what really matters is the device and we should be studying the impressions because they show the artistry of the carver better, and certainly for many stones, when they're not expertly photographed, such as our photographer Tani Cracchiola does, it's sometimes hard, even holding it in your hand, to see the detail. Certainly when they've carved the inscriptions to be read on the stone, and given what we know about the mystical values of the stones, we have to consider the impressions, the stones themselves, not less important than the impressions. This gem is carved relatively deeply. You can get a sense from the impression of the volumes of the musculature, the overlap. It's wonderful. You even have the dots of the fingers of the god coming through the strings on the other side. And this, of course, is a scarab. Another gem, this one happens to be earlier chronologically, but that's not so important, is carved very shallowly on the stone. It's on a model jasper. And I wish I had gone with my iPhone and taken a photograph of this gem, because it would have been very difficult to see the impression. It's only when it's expertly lit and it's carved in very shallow relief. You see this amazing impression of a cicada on a leaf with little, on a stem with little leaves coming out. This was also part of a swivel ring, as you can see from the sides. But this is not a scarab, it's what we call a scaraboid. It's in the shape of a scarab with a high domed back of this beautiful mottled jasper, but it's not carved as a scarab. And I won't go into great detail, but this chart gives you a sense of different shapes, and there is something of a chronological progression even within different kinds of scarabs. This is the shape of that scaraboid with the cicada, and then these were all set in swivel rings. The Romans tended to set their gems in ring casings. Here's an impression of that gem, which is large. It's about 1.5 inches. And again, the detail, the veining of the wings, the sense of transparency, the delicacy of all these legs looking. Now, this gem isn't signed, but many carvers actually signed their works, just as we know ancient sculptors signed their works and ancient painters signed their works. I show you here an exquisite scaraboid in Chalcedony that signed Epimenes Epoie, Epimenes made me, and the letters are actually written backwards, so they read in impressions, Epimenes made me. And it's fantastic with this youth in 3/4 back view, taming a rearing horse that has a great top knot and bridle and tassels, again, all in the space of about 1 inch. And his signature, Epimenes Epoie, follows the formula that other Greek artists do, whether they're vase painters, sculptors, metal workers, or even die engravers working on coins. And there's some evidence that gem engravers sometimes worked as die engravers on coins. Now, we have this, what's considered the masterpiece of Epimenes, but here I show you 4 other gems, including the one copied by Chavdar in the Getty collection, that we've been able to attribute to Epimenes the same way art historians will attribute unsigned works to famous painters. You can notice that the 2 archers have a similar 3/4 back view, head in profile, wonderful emphasis on musculature, and this strange treatment of the Achilles tendon going from the knee across the calf down to the heel. So these 2 gems in Boston and New York have been attributed to Epimenes, as have these 2 of youths raising their leg, slightly different poses, but again, the treatment of the musculature in the head is very similar. So we've attributed these works to Epimenes. One of the greatest works of the subsequent period, the classical period, not one of the greatest works, one of the greatest carvers. These are from the late Archaic period, around 500 BC. From around 400 BC is a carver named Dexamenos. This is a Chalcedony scaraboid in the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge. It's inscribed to be read on the stone with the name of Mike in the Greek genitive of Mike. Mike is small. Maybe her name is small or tiny, and she's sitting on her chair in her wonderful flowing drapery, complete with weights at the corners, and a servant girl is bringing her a wreath and a mirror, and we have the signature of the carver Dexamenos here. Many of the images on gems come from the same general repertoire that we see in culture at the time. So you can see the scene is very similar to that appears on Athenian gravestones. A woman with a mirror whose servant is bringing her, in this case, a jewelry box rather than a wreath. Dexamenos was one of the great carvers, and he signed quite a few, and these stones, they're small, they can get lost, they can be broken, they can be chipped, but they often survived. And one of the great works by Dexamenos is this, a mottled jasper in the Boston collection that was formerly owned by Sir Arthur Evans, the famous excavator of Knossos and discoverer of Minoan civilization. It's this amazing portrait of a middle-aged man. Each hair has been engraved, even like wispy hair on top. He has eyebrows. Each eyelash has been carved, a very fine beard. We don't know who he is, but he got a gem by Dexamenos. And here I show you, I'm sorry, not one of our impressions, an old plaster impression. And you can see again, the signature was meant to be read on the gem, not on the coin. This gem, if you were to hold it in your hands, if you go to Boston and the light's not good, you can hardly see it. You have to have it at the right angle. And ancient writers talked about the magic of gems. Not only they could replicate themselves through impressions on wax or clay, but just by rotating them the right way, or licking them, or pouring oil on them, the image would seem to magically appear. You get a world, and of course, the more you look, the more closely you look, the more you'd see. The style of the carving of the inscription also follows contemporary norms, and you notice that Dexamenos has lined up very neatly all the letters of his name with the verb apoie made this. And this is what we call stoichidon, that the Greeks called stoichidon, in a row. And this is exactly how, at the same period, official inscriptions were carved, official documents of the Athenian state. Dexamenos was a meticulous craftsman, and the Boston gem and this next one in St. Petersburg in the Hermitage is one of his acknowledged masterpieces, showing a heron or a crane in flight with his name again in stoichidon. And it says not only Dexamenos made this, Dexamenos apoie, but also Chios, the island of Chios. That must have been Dexamenos' home. The gem in Boston was found in a grave in Athens. This one was found on the Black Sea. We don't know what the meaning of the heron is. There are lots of herons around the Black Sea. Does it have some mythological meaning? But here I think there's a wonderful conceit that the carver has chosen a light sky blue chalcedony stone for this flying bird, as if it's flying through the sky. So whatever magical meaning might have been implied by the chalcedony, just the color contributes to the overall composition. Dexamenos signed this stone on the left, another model jasper, also in the Hermitage from the Black Sea. It's a little beat up, as you can see, but there's his name. We have the heron turning back, the wonderful wings, and it's about to pluck at a grasshopper or a cicada here. And here's an unsigned gem that has been attributed to Dexamenos, or maybe a workshop associated with him. These are all scaraboids. They would have been part of seal rings. But because of the mottled jasper stone, the fineness of the engraving, the relative shallowness of the engraving, and comparison of the animal, we attribute our new gem to the hand of Dexamenos, or a master. As I said, this gem is relatively large, 1.5 inches. This cornelian gem showing Ajax attacking Cassandra, dragging her from the statue of Athena at the sack of the Trojan War. set in a modern ring, is one of the smallest ones in the collection. It's about the size of my thumbnail. It's another example of gem engravers using some of the same motifs as that appear in other art. Whether this motif had particular meaning to its owner is difficult to say in this case. What I want to show you here are some of the details of this gem that, again, is one of the smallest in the collection. Ajax not only has his whole panoply of armor, the crested helmet, the shield, the greaves, but the shield in profile has a head of Medusa carved on it, and on his cuirass here, he has a winged griffin. In fact, this was misdescribed in earlier publications as a Pegasus. I mean, the detail is so small. Cassandra is on the ground, partially nude, reference to what Ajax is going to do to her. And significantly, the carver has made the statue of Athena on the pedestal turn its head away. A lot more detail in this tiny, tiny gem than in this much larger pot, I think. One of my favorites from the new group is this red mottled jasper showing the hero Perseus. He's famous, of course, for having killed the Gorgon Medusa, and this is another one of those cases where without excellent photography or holding the gem in your hands and manipulating it, you almost don't see what's going on. And of course, the blood red mottled color of the stone, I think, reflects the blood of Medusa when Perseus beheaded her. But this is a moment before where he's tiptoeing forward. He has his winged cap of invisibility, and there might be a play in that in the gem. The image is actually invisible until you get it at the right angle. His winged sandals. He has his two spears and the hook, the harpe, with which he's going to behead the Medusa, and he holds his thumb up to his lips in this gesture of pensive anticipation. And the rendering of his musculature is just exquisite. Again, the sense of a volume of overlapping is unsurpassed in this very, very small compass. Detail of the upper part and his very, very powerful body. And the sandals are fantastic. And the play with 1 foot in profile and 1 foot foreshortened. Gem engravers generally do things in profile. That's the clearest aspect. That's why we often have profiles on our coins. Doing things in frontally or 3/4 is much more difficult and is a symbol of virtuosity. And I think the most exquisite of all of our new gems is this one, the amethyst intaglio of the orator Demosthenes. It's not very big, but it's carved very deeply, showing the orator in very, very high relief. And you can see it has an inscription that's meant to be read actually in the impression, Dioscoridou, of Dioscorides, who was one of the few gem engravers that's actually mentioned in ancient literary sources. And we'll come back to how we know about him. But this, again, is a type that's well known. It's an image of the great orator, the Athenian orator Demosthenes, who lived in the 4th century BC. This was carved around the time of the late Republic, probably around 40 BC, so 350 years after the orator's death. But for the Romans, and we have lots of Roman portraits of him in marble and in bronze, he was a symbol of political integrity. He spoke truth to power, and his image was often carved on gemstones in the Roman period. At this time of great turmoil in Rome, it seems, as a signal of adherence to republican values, to democratic values of the state, because Demosthenes was really struggling to keep Athens independent as Philip of Macedon, Alexander's father, was conquering Greece. We have another Roman intaglio of Demosthenes in our collection, signed by Apelles, famous name of a Greek painter, but different artists use the same name. This one has suffered from fire, and so the gem has kind of gone white in streaks. So here especially, it's useful to have an impression that again shows you the great volume of carvings, the expressions of the musculature and the flesh. These are all derived from earlier Greek portrait type, because after Demosthenes' death, the Athenians honored him, we know this, by a statue that was set up in the city center. And so all of these gem portraits look back to that earlier portrait. But why in this period particularly so many images of Demosthenes? Well, Demosthenes, as I said, made these speeches called the Philippics against Philip of Macedon. And during the Roman civil wars, Cicero made a series of speeches against Mark Antony that he called the Philippics. So the image of Demosthenes, while initially maybe pro-Republican, comes to be anti-Antonian. And we know in the end it's Antony with Cleopatra versus Octavian, who becomes Augustus. And Dioscorides, who made our gem, and there were many, many other Demosthenes floating around Rome at this period, but Dioscorides, who carved our gem, which is far and away the highest quality of them all, is recorded by ancient literary sources as having carved the final seal ring of the Emperor Augustus. So what we have here, a little chipped, a little battered, a little weathered, is a work from the hand of the gem carver of the Emperor Augustus. We're talking about the cream of ancient gem carvers that has come down to us. We have other works by Dioscorides. We don't have Augustus's seal, but we have a cameo in Berlin showing the great hero Heracles wrestling the hellhound Cerberus. There's Heracles' lion skin. Instead of having 3 heads, Cerberus here has only 2, but we also see Heracles' club. Again, very small, 1.5 inches. And one of my favorites is this gem that belongs to the Duke and Duchess of Devonshire. And in 1856, it was set into the Devonshire parure, this amazing group of tiaras, necklaces, breastplates. This is it here that was made for the Maria Countess Granville to wear to the coronation of the Tsar Nicholas Alexander II in Russia. But these are ancient gems reset in the Victorian period, and this gem right here is also signed by Dioscorides, and it shows the hero Diomedes sitting on an altar holding a sword, having stolen the Palladium necessary for the fall of Troy, but in doing so, he killed a priest, which is a no-no, so the god Poseidon turns his back. And again, like our Perseus, carved hundreds years earlier, the treatment of the musculature, of the detail, of the 3/4 perspective is quite extraordinary. And again, I'm spoiling you in a sense as I keep showing you the very best gems. Here's another one showing the same scene on this green plasma. And this is the more normal treatment. You can see it's the same scene with the hero seated holding a sword, having stolen the statue of the goddess, the god on the pillar. He's left out the priest, but you can, I think, without further description, recognize the difference in quality. Now, the Emperor Augustus, we're told, over the course of his life, used different seal stones. Early in his life, he found, it is said by Pliny, in a jewelry cabinet of his mother, 2 identical seals showing a sphinx. This isn't one of them. This is a sphinx gem of the period in our collection that might reflect what that looked like. And it was very useful for him to have 2, because he could use one himself and he can give one to his lieutenants who could seal official decrees and act in his stead. That sphinx may have looked something more like this a sphinx, a seated sphinx on Augustus's coins. We don't know. The Sphinx, of course, is not the most positive character in mythology and is most famous for its riddling utterances. And there was a lot of whispering about how inscrutable Augustus was. And so he decided to abandon the Sphinx, and his second seal was said to be the seal of Alexander the Great that had been carved by the great carver Pergotales in the late 4th century BC. Alexander was said to have only allowed 3, or certainly to have preferred 3 artists to paint him. Apelles, not the gem engraver, Apelles the painter in paint, Lysippus in sculpture, and Pergotales in stone. This isn't the gem by Pergotales, although some people have optimistically hoped it was. Unlike Dioscorides, we don't have any gems we know were by Pergotales. And then the final one, the portrait of Augustus by Dioscorides, is lost. We have earlier portraits of him, like this one, before he became Augustus, when he was still Octavian, soon after the assassination of his great uncle who adopted him, Julius Caesar. And you can see he has a beard grown for mourning, very much like on his coins here with the Temple of Divine Julius. This is another one of our new group. It's very small. It would have been set in a ring stone and probably would have been worn by an official or a senator, an aristocrat, or someone who wanted to show their loyalty to Octavian in these civil wars. So you could have your personal insignia that related to you, but you could also demonstrate your political affiliations. The lost gemstone of Augustus with his image was probably the imperial seal for all of the Julio-Claudian emperors, would have been passed from Augustus to Tiberius, to Claudius, to Caligula, to Claudius, let's get them in the right order, and then on to Nero. That gem is lost. But this stunning gem, now in the Naples Museum, which passed through the hands of Lorenzo de' Medici, was thought in the Renaissance to be the seal of Nero, the sigillo di Nerone, for 2 reasons. One, it shows Apollo and the satyr Marsyas with a tail, and Marsyas is tied up because in competition with Apollo, you remember, he played the flutes while Apollo played the lyre, and Apollo wins, and as the loser, he gets hung up and flayed, and his friend Olympus is here begging Apollo. The reason this gets associated with Nero is Apollo often appeared on Nero's coins. Nero famously loved to play the lyre, fiddling while Rome burned. This is not the seal of Nero, but the seal of Nero would have been this image of Augustus carved by Dioscorides. And although this gem isn't signed by Dioscorides, it only has the Renaissance carving of name of Lorenzo de' Medici, I think, having looked very closely at both, that the attribution of it to Dioscorides holds. Again, if you compare the detailed rendering of the muscular body in 3/4 to the seated Marsyas, the composition of the one leg raised, the other leg lowered, the depth of the carving, I think there's very good reason to think here is another gem by Dioscorides. Whatever the case, this gem was very famous in the Renaissance. What I showed you is a bronze impression, and here on a painting of Simonetta Vespucci by Botticelli, you see she's wearing a kind of replica of this gem, actually done as a cameo. And Lorenzo de' Medici praised his gems very, very highly. In the inventories after his death, their values are much, much higher than his paintings because, one, they're valuable antiques, but they're of valuable semi-precious stones. And thus, even before the Medici, they were collected by kings and queens and bishops and popes. They were illustrated in the margins of illuminated manuscripts, painted on Renaissance pottery, and then on into the Enlightenment, appeared in very fancy Sèvres teapots. They were collected also by intellectuals and aristocrats in the Renaissance Enlightenment, and they formed the subject of very learned treatises. One of the great collections by Abraham Gorlaeus in Antwerp was his Dactyliotheque. You remember that Doris of Samos was a dactylioergos. This dactylio is a ring. So a dactyliotheque is a ring collection, and you can see he's got a box with drawers to keep his rings in. The way these were studied and promulgated in the Renaissance was often through prints, and these are some pages from Gorlaeus' collection. But they were also, in this period, again, it was recognized that gem engraving was as high an art as architecture, painting, and sculpture. And here is an engraving from the frontispiece of the publication of the Duc d'Orléans collection. This is the brother of the French king, and it shows the personification of gem engraving, holding up a gem and being a beacon, as all these little putti are showing engravings and drawers with gems. And it's gem engraving that's teaching architecture, sculpture, and painting. These personifications are all looking to gem engraving for inspiration. Better than prints, much better than prints for understanding gems, were collections of impressions. And these were sometimes sumptuous. Sometimes they took the form of these wonderful faux books. You spin this around and you have the drawers, and you could collect and trade the impressions. So this is the way they traveled. And one of the greatest collections of the Renaissance was the Marlborough collection, formed by George Spencer, the fourth Duke of Marlborough, in the 18th century. And this is his family portrait by Sir Joshua Reynolds. And in the corner here, you can see the Duke and his son. And his son is actually holding a red leather-bound case that was one of 9 that had his fantastic collection. And what he holds in his hand is an amazing cameo that's now in Cologne of the Emperor Augustus. The Marlborough collection was dispersed, but in the early 2000s, Sir John Boardman at Oxford, who is one of the great scholars of ancient gems, worked to reconstitute the collection and published a book that's on your handouts on the Marlborough gems, many of which go back to earlier collections of the Dukes of Arundel or the Gonzaga in Mantua. And for the cover of his book, Boardman chose the broken but still exquisite portrait of Antinous, the favorite of the Emperor Hadrian, from the Marlborough collection, that has a little bit of an inscription here that says Ant. Whether it says Antinous or Antonionis, it's the name of the carver, we don't know, because it's been broken, it's been set in gold with the missing bits completed, so it would still work as a seal. This too, we were very thrilled to be able to acquire last May. It's of this black chalcedony, and again, carved in low relief, but with exquisite details for the hair. Antinous holds a spear. He's depicted as a young hunter. Gems like this inspired modern carvers as well. Here is an 18th century carver, Birch, who signs his own name on his replica in cornelian. I just want to close by saying I've talked a lot about how sometimes engravers looked to works of art that pre-existed them, like the portrait of Demosthenes or the type of Ajax going at Cassandra. But again, it was recognized in the 18th century and earlier that gem engraving was really a beacon. I'm sure many of you visiting Florence might have gone to the Palazzo Medici Riccardi, and you may have seen the wonderful Adoration of the Magi there by Benozzo Gozzoli. But as you went through the courtyard designed by Michelozzo, you may have noticed large-scale roundels set into the walls. These are huge blow-ups, as it were, carved in marble of the Medici gem collection. You can recognize Demosthenes holding the Palladion. Here's Daedalus and Icarus. And here, again, Lorenzo carved his initials into the gem. Or Athena and Poseidon disputing control of Athens, and Athena's gift was the olive tree. Last year, separate from our most recent purchase, we were able to acquire this wonderful, very shallow gem that was also part of the Marlborough collection, showing a seated woman and a standing male. And there's been a lot of debate over who these figures are. In fact, again, having been promulgated through impressions, and I'm sorry this is not well focused, but in one of the early collections of casts, the Dactylotheca of Tommaso Cares, which is now in Berlin, you'll see that the carving is so subtle that this impression didn't pick up all the detail. And what's missing is the hunter's stick, the throwing stick held by the young man, which I believe is the key to identifying who this is. This gem can be traced back to the early 18th century, knowing who owned it. But it's been pointed out by my colleague Judith Barr that it bears an uncanny resemblance to Guido Reni's Bacchus and Ariadne in Lakma. And if Judith is right, and I think she is, that this gem inspired this painting, we can trace back the history of the gem another century. But Reni probably didn't see the gem. He might have seen an impression like this without the hunting stick, and so he interpreted this as Theseus and Ariadne. Other couples from antiquity have been proposed, but the throwing stick is actually one of the attributes of the young hunter Anchises. We saw Anchises as an old man on this gem, bearded, being carried by Aeneas. But in this case, the hunting stick is held by his grandson, Ascanius. And that's the standard iconography of that Trojan family. And here's another gem, not as fine in our collection, where Ascanius holds the hunting stick. So here it seems that a mistaken identification may have inspired Guido Reni, but what we have here, carved at the period of the time of Augustus, is probably Anchises meeting Venus on Mount Ida outside of Troy. This is the beginning of the Trojan family. The offspring of this union is Aeneas, and that is the foundation of Rome. This is the kind of erudite puzzling and genealogical projection that was so important to the Romans. And for one last example, I'll leave you with the influence of ancient glyptic gem carving on Renaissance painting is, again, from the Augustus period, a stunning cameo, now in Alnwick Castle belonging to the Dukes of Northumberland, showing a youth in which many people have recognized the portrait features of Augustus on a Capricorn. This is Augustus's zodiac sign going over the sea, and you can see dolphins here. So you have this image of power over land and sea, which was very important for Augustan propaganda. This gem, again, its entire history is not known, but it was sketched in the Renaissance, where it was in the collection of Cardinal Domenico Grimani in the 15th century. Some of these gems went underground, but many of them never did and passed from hand to hand, entered royal, imperial, or church treasuries. It seems quite plausible that this image was also seen by Michelangelo. And I leave you with this. Thank you very much for your attention. I believe we have time for a few questions if you have any, and I can try to answer them. Yes, sir.
I wonder, how do people see these things? There were no lenses, correct? So is it just because you're young and you're nearsighted? I mean, these are extremely small details that people are able to see without any aids that I'm aware of, except lighting, I suppose.
The question is, how did people see them without any kind of lenses? The Greeks knew some of the magnificatory principles of rock crystal, and there are stories in the Hellenistic period of using lenses to burn things and putting lenses in towers at Alexandria and shooting ray beams at ships and things. But for magnification for looking, there's no evidence. You'd look at them by holding them close to your eyes. If you were nearsighted, you had an advantage. Sometimes the impressions are easy to read. I mentioned a text that talk about the miraculous appearances from images, either when the stones are moistened or impressed. There's a wonderful story from the Renaissance that Lorenzo de' Medici wants to buy some gems in Venice, and he sends his agent there. And he gets very impatient because nothing happens. And he's writing angry letters to his agent, and the agent writes back, saying, "It's been cloudy for the past 2 weeks. The light's bad. I can't evaluate the quality of the gems because the light's bad. We're spoiled by magnification, electron light, and fantastic photography. But for them, they would have been much harder to see." And in my view, that makes the craftsmanship inherent in these all the more amazing.
So these lenses that they did, like with those are rock crystals they used then for what you were talking about?
Well, I think those are fantasies. They knew you could light leaves on fire with a rock crystal lens. The idea of melting ships at sea was, it's like Star Wars technology. It was ancient fantasy. Yeah.
Anybody else have any questions for him? No? Well.
Who has the biggest collection? Would it be the Vatican?
The Vatican doesn't have a very big collection. Catherine the Great was a great enthusiast, and she actually learned gem engraving. And in the Hermitage, they have a huge collection, and they have gems, not only ancient gems, but Renaissance and Enlightenment gems, and gems carved by Catherine the Great herself. The National Museum in Naples inherited the Farnese collection, which had belonged to the Medici, and so that grew. The Cabinet des Médailles in Paris has essentially the French royal collections. The Boston Museum of Fine Arts has a stunning collection. So those are the really big ones. And that's of really top-notch gems that devolved from aristocratic collectors. There's a small museum in the town of Aquileia, up by Venice in Italy, that has a huge collection of gems from graves, and it seems to have been a glyptic workshop, but those are not of the quality of these, but those were kind of gems for the masses, gems of lower quality that people would have for their seal stones. Yeah.
How do you pronounce your last name?
Lapatin is how you pronounce my last name. But people call me lots of things. I like Lapatin, which is aristocratic French, but, it's not my name. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thank you so much for...
Thank you very much.